Uh, Good day, everyone. I'm thrilled to see a happy number of participants in our session this 20th of May. My name is Wendy Pfeffer. I'm currently a visiting scholar at the University of Pennsylvania with a deep interest in medieval food and culture. Our session today is called On the Edge of Cookery. I think you'll agree the three papers all skirt and then dive deeply into the topic. We have a moderator who will be watching the Q&A session, the questions et réponses, in the person of Helmut Klug, very talented. I've got lots of faith in him. Moving quickly to the speakers because that's the important part. I open with an introduction to our first speaker. Bruno Laurioux needs no introduction to this audience. He is the président or chair of the Institut Européen d'Histoire et des Cultures Alimentaires, and he's PI, the principal investigator of the CoReMA project. In other words, he's our host. His presentation today, The Secrets of the Cook, Tour de Main and Tour de Force in the collection of recipes from the 12th to the 17th century, builds on a career of study of culinary history. Bruno.
Hello to everybody. Thank you, Wendy. In 1588, Giambattista della Porta published in Venice the Magia Naturalis, which became one of the most famous collections of secrets during the Renaissance. Chapter 14 of the second book dedicated 8 pages to banquets and meals astonishingly prepared. In the second version of Magia Naturalis, this section was considerably enlarged to a complete book, which included no less than 13 chapters and 59 recipes under the current title of De Re Coquinaria. Contrary to one might think from this title, it was not an extract of Apicius' famous cookbook, but a mixture of recipes coming from different origins. Some of them pertain to cookery at first glance, how to tenderize different kinds of meat, how to make a meat sweet or bitter, how to cook a fish or a capon in different ways but simultaneously, how to prepare a peacock so that it seems alive, how to serve a pigeon without any bones, or even how to cook chicken and eggs without fire, what to do if there is no more salt in the kitchen or at the table, how to make meat looking like bloody or full of worms. Advices on the choice of foods according to season or because of their medical properties, or on the different ways to fatten an animal that will produce the tasty food, or about the preparation and improvement of wines, are obviously taken from agronomical and medical tracts whose authors are frequently mentioned. Was it also the case for the culinary recipes that we find in this collection? In other words, could we link them to the important literature of cookbooks that flourished in Western Europe since the 13th and even the 12th century? This is the simple question I want to deal with. If many historians of sciences and technology have been interested in secrets, we can mention Imon's book. It was mainly under the perspective to understand one possible origin of modern science. Therefore, the alchemical and medical secrets hold their attention. Recently, Professor Smith's Making and Knowing project, which inspired so much our symposium, has shed a bright light on craft techniques. In the 16th century collection that is used by your team, few recipes on food are embedded in long list of ways for making weapons, jewelry, and so on. On the side, the historians of literature usually consider as juggler's tricks the technical instruction intended for creating events that will surprise the guests. In fact, 15th century culinary collections included this last kind of recipes under the category of entremets, as shown by the food writer Jeremy Parzon for the Italian treatises. But some other and much simpler culinary tricks can also be found in many medieval cookbooks. My main purpose here will be first to trace the textual and cultural traditions that linked Renaissance book of secrets with the culinary recipe literature. Apparently, the two ones were very different between them regarding their content and organization, as well as their authors and readers. After this typology and then genealogy, I will focus, if I have time, on the famous example of the peacock coated with its feathers as it seems alive, a spectacular dish which appeared in real banquets, but was also a topic of the chivalry literature. The starting point of this short inquiry can be the books of secrets themselves. William Emon's book has drawn attention to the huge development of the literatures of secrets during the 16th century, and more broadly of practical books. According to him, the movement began simultaneously in Germany and in Italy as early as the 1520s, when was printed in Venice the Opera Nova, also entitled D'Ufficio di Ricette, House of Recipes. We can add another Opera Nova, the Refettorio, attributed to the Stacchio Celebrino. This booklet of only 16 pages included an appendix of secrets pertaining to the cooking and the conservation of meat and fruits. Step by step, the books of secrets were enriched by new recipes that could concern cookery or food in the broad sense of the word. Finally, from the 1550s on, with the generation of the professors of secrets, as Emon called them, the number of this kind of recipes could reach dozens. In the Middle Ages, the category of secrets was not as integrative as in the Renaissance. If the Latin word secretum exists, it was only used in very few titles, at the famous pseudo-Aristotelian secretum secretorum, which is both a regimen sanitatis and a regimen principum, or the secreta mulierum, definitely a medical work. In fact, mirabilium, that means marvel, is the good word from the 12th century at least, and still in the 5th century. In the medieval thought, as Jacques Le Goff often said, mirabilia indicates a kind of phenomenon that cannot be explained by the laws of the scientia. That means, in the Middle Ages, the Aristotelian science, nor by a divine intervention, which is meant by miracula. This kind of phenomenon, mirabilia, cannot be explained, but can concretely be experimented. The best way to know it is to describe how it occurs as precisely as possible, and also how it can be reproduced. That is to say, to write a recipe. That's why, probably a collection of very diverse recipes was entitled The Marvels of the World, De Mirabilibus Mundi. Interestingly, it will be included in a famous collection falsely attributed to the 13th century theologian Albert the Great, under the name Experiments and Secrets by Albert. The title of the specialist section on food in Giovanni della Porta Magia Naturalis, namely De Miro Conviviorum Apparatum, banquets and meals astonishingly prepared, is clearly part of this tradition that highlights the concept of mirabilia. Logically, this is also the term that a scribe of the first 16th century chose to identify in a cookbook known as Cuoco Napoletano, a series of recipes that were usually considered as entremets. This list of mirabilia gulae, the marvels of gula, a notion that itself aggregates the sin of gluttony and the excessive research in food. This list doesn't agree with that given by the Magia Naturalis, except two recipes: how a cooked peacock can seem to be living, and how to cook a pigeon without bones. Obviously, I have to enlarge my corpus on a long-term period, optimally from the beginning of the 14th century, or even the beginning of the 12th century, to the beginning of the 17th century. The result of this operation is not completely satisfying. The cookbooks I found relevant are mainly medieval, whereas the books of secrets are concentrated on the early modern time. It can be a bias, but it could also suggest one hypothesis: the migration of some kind of recipes from cookbooks to books of secrets. As imperfect as it is, these enlarged corpus allow the food historian to build a working typology of mirabilia recipes that we find in cookbooks and or books of secrets. A typology which doesn't necessarily agree with the classification used in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. It includes, first, ambiguities, illusions, and pranks. For example, crude that seems cooked and living that seems dead, but also the contrary, dead or inanimate that seems living. There's a lot of recipes on this topic, as the one which prescribes to gild a living capon with nut oil, dry blood powder, and egg yolks. Not a recipe to recommend today, I'm afraid, especially since the bird has previously been plucked live. The unusual cooking methods exposed in our corpus show the same unbridled imagination. How to cook a hen in a bottle or even in paper without fire inside another animal, or to fry, boil, and grill fish in the same time. You see here a recipe which pretends to really dissolve the bones of a pigeon. Finally, in the last category, we have simple tricks to save a too salty dish or to remove the taste and smell of burning. Most of these tours de force look for the surprise. The guests are supposed to be amazed by them. This is the wow effect, as we can say now. The high-level cooks who worked for princes or kings had to master the skills necessary for the reproduction of these dishes. And it was really the case, judging by some famous culinary collection as Chicard Fait de Cuisine on 1420 and Martineau's Libro de Arte Culinaria about 1460. Between them, a manuscript that transmits the viandier attributed then to Taiwan also includes some entremets. According to William Eman, there was a proliferation of books of secrets in the late Middle Ages. We can see at least 3 different traditions which flourished from the 12th century with different tempos. First, Secret of the Nature. Second, Secrets of Medicine. 3, Secrets of the Arts, techniques as painting, dyeing or grafting, pyrotechnics and cookery. These 3 traditions are action-oriented, and as such, they are often intricate and included in the same manuscript or even in the same text. For example, in the collection of Secreta and Experimenta that was ascribed to the famous theologian Albert the Great, as we said, in the third part of this compilation, we can read a quite simple recipe that you find here, which did not exactly pertain to cookery, but surely to a banquet. Indeed, this recipe explains how to make a chicken jump in a disc, probably a dish or maybe the round plate under the trencher bread. The chicken is already dead, of course, cooked and supposed to be eaten. Therefore, to move it, the author prescribed to use some products which are not really edible: quicksilver, alias mercury, and powder of calamine, maybe calamine, a mineral. This recipe never crossed the limits of the books of secret, as also the one that explain how to make a raw meat seeming full of worms. The route taken by the following recipe was much more complicated. Let's use the regressive method for once. The most recent example I found of the recipe that cook the same fish in 3 different ways simultaneously is the second secret of the first cookbook published in Poland in 1682. The pike it uses has its head fried, its tail roasted, and the middle boiled. At the same time, circulated in Europe one of the biggest book of secrets, the one compiled by Jean-Jacques Wecker. For Wecker himself, frequently used Giambattista della Porta, and it was the case for this recipe, which was present in the very first edition of Della Porta's Magia Naturalis in 1558. You have noticed that the recipe coming from this book of secrets uses lamprey and not pike. But in the last decades of the 15th century, we find a cookbook, a German cookbook written by Meister Eberhard that already preferred to cook pike in these three ways. One of the most famous cookbooks of the Italian Renaissance, which was written around 1460, but remained very influent until the middle of the 16th century, the Libro de Arte Coquinaria by Maestro Martino, probably gave the canonical recipe for pike again or other big fish, Martino adds. The title highlights the issue. Besides the surprise effect, a great cook has to ensure that the fish won't be broken. Note the precautions that are taken to avoid a direct contact with fire or boiling water, and to keep intact the parts which have not yet been cooked. But Martino did not invent this hazardous dish. We find at least two previous recipes some decades before. One in the supplements that the copyist living in the then Burgundian states added to the Viandier of Taiwan. This Vivandier gives a quite important additional information, namely that the fish must be not only cooked in three ways, but also to appear in three colors and throw fire through the mouth, exactly like the spectacular entremet that the guests began to appreciate very much during the banquets of the time. This is exactly the function of the luxe, that is to say the pike, that another great cook, Maître Chicard, described around 1420 in his Fait de Cuisine, probably the most detailed cookbook of the Middle Ages, along with the one written by Martino. Here, this already complicated dish is just a part of the very complex entremet of a castle, including towers, boar heads throwing fire, singers, etc. The two recipes here look alike, even if the articulations between colors and cooking are different. Two concluding remarks on this part. First, last Monday, Helmut Klug told us that this recipe of fish in three ways were a European one. He was right. Second, this recipe came from cookbook before entering the literature of secrets. When De la Porta or others pretend to have compiled the art, that is to say the technique of cooks, they are right. Maybe partly right. I'm afraid of running out of time if I want to develop my last part. So I will be very short, my dear Wendy. The most important part is the last one, as you know. Why? Because the recipe in question is probably the one which symbolizes most of the time the so-called courtly life of the Middle Ages. I mean, the peacock coated with its feathers. That is to say, the peacock. The habit to eat really big birds began early in the 14th century, maybe in France. It's a debated question. It increased during the 15th century. The peacock had a big reputation And it is said even inside the cookbook, as you see here, but we have no time to comment. Second point, the recipe for coated bird began not by the peacock, but by the swan. And it was only around 1450 that the recipe for coated peacock is ready. Second conclusion. Third conclusion, books, there is a parallel, between the literary motive, the culinary elaboration, and the implementation in real banquets. And it can be followed step by step. Fourth point, books of secrets still wrote about peacock during the 16th and 17th century. That is to say, a time supposedly when the peacock disappeared off the table. In fact, the peacock and the swan didn't disappear, for example, from the supply contract of the French courts during this period. And last dia, we are, of course, in a work in progress with complex relationships from cookbooks and books of secrets with go and return. And that's why we need another Congress next year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruno. I confess you've run over a little bit. There is a question for you in the Q&A. Do we have to take all these secret recipes literally? The idea of cooking without fire, cooking in a bottle. Are these, do we think these recipes represent practices that were actually done, or is some of it mythological? This question comes from the Q&A.
I see the question of Cécile Chevalier.
Voila, you have 1 minute to answer.
Okay. In fact, this is the problem, of course, with this kind of literature. I must say that as soon as it is in the cookbooks, there is a suspicion that it will be done. If it stays in the secret books, the suspicion exists that it was not be done. But we can look at the words by themselves and be cautious about the words. For example, we have always in this kind of book the word experimentatum est, probatissimum est. It was proved, it was experimented. But from a long time, we know, thanks to the historians of science, that it has not to be taken literally, of course. It means that it was verified in the authorities for this kind of literature, but not necessary that it was experimented as we know, as we define today. I don't know if I answered the question.
I think you did. And now I fear we must turn to, not fear, I'm happy to turn to our second speaker because I'm really watching the clock. Azélina Jaboulet-Vercherre vaunts her training across multiple disciplines, but it all comes back to wine. Wine museums in France for her BA in art history, wine and drunkenness in Hemingway's prose for her master's degree in Anglophone studies, and her book, The Physician, the Drinker, and the Drunk, Wine's uses and abuses in late medieval natural philosophy comes out of her doctoral work in history. She speaks today on alcoholic recipes from wine to distilled liquor, late medieval and early modern times. I remind the audience you can ask questions of Bruno, of Azélina, and of Federica in the Q&A, and it's now Azélina's turn.
Wine in late medieval natural philosophical texts is presented as a compound substance, hot and dry by nature, as opposed to water, a simple ingredient, cold and wet by nature. From such premises dating back to ancient lore, medieval physicians could recommend wine in medical treatments, thereby devising therapeutic recipes. Today, I will tell you more about wine through the rather risky lens of its distilled form. But before I delve into such fascinating material, let me introduce the stakes of the subject. Talking about alcohol when discussing medieval text places historians in front of one of their worst enemies, anachronism. The term alcohol did not exist in Latin until the 13th century and was not used before the very end of the medieval period. It comes from the Arabic al-kul, whose origin seems paradoxical in that it described not a liquid, but a powder used in ancient eye makeup. In the absence of the modern notion of alcohol, medieval authors relied on the terms vapors and fumes to describe wine inebriating agents. Vapor is a substance somewhere between air and water, one that results from the transformation of water as it is heated or wine as it is digested. Vapors are therefore more watery than fumes, which combine airy and fiery elements, but more airy than the wines they come from. They are wine's subtle features as opposed to the earthiness of must, for instance. As such, vapors account for wine's virtues in the distillation process. Distillation used to be the prerogative of alchemists, physicians, and apothecaries until the 15th century, when the resulting liquor became a beverage sold by common merchants and specialist wine retailers alike, when techniques were implemented to satisfy increasing demand. Even though alcohol can be obtained by distilling all kinds of substances, which had been done since antiquity, the text I chose focuses on the process of distilling wine. Wine was also deemed particularly suitable because of the philosophical connections between life and wine. The divine water, another term for its distilled form, was believed to transform human beings by refining their best components. The search for this subtle essence also refers to a spiritual quest and is connected to the ideas of alchemical elixir and the philosopher's stone. Because of its perceived perfection, it is also called quinta essentia. The quintessence, by definition, is considered a fifth element whose incorruptibility may heal corrupted bodies belonging to the sublunary world. By extension, it came to designate the highest level of purity of a given quality, thereby becoming more conceptual. Michele Savonarola, 1385-1466, an important character in the line of court physicians and university professors, wrote an opusculum on alcohol in Latin under the title Libellus Optimus de Aquavita, dated 1440, which he translated into vernacular as I trattati in volgare della peste e dell'acqua ardente. It was the second part. This treatise is the only text in which he discusses spirits. One potential explanation lies in the difficulty to give it a scientific place among medical therapeutics. it is impossible to explain within Galenic medicine. Now, dedicated to Antonio Roselli, it bridges gaps between the Arabic and Latin worlds as much as between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Savonarola relied on the same textual authorities as his illustrious predecessors, such as Taddeo Alderotti. A century or so later, he still adhered to the Galenic theory of qualities and to the Aristotelian tradition in which the late medieval early Renaissance polymath Savonarola acknowledged the influence of celestial and supercelestial phenomenon, as well as that of superior forces, superior also involving that they are hidden to most of us. Savonarola marked the beginning of a new era and exemplified a highly learned Italian milieu. Treatises on spirits, particularly that of Michele Savonarola, also provide information on the importance of a wine's strength and emphasize the restorative virtues of wine. In this treatise, Savonarola asserts with firm conviction that wine is not only the most nourishing thing, but that the elixir one can extract from it contains an active power, and that with both nutritional and restorative virtues. With wine, we have passive virtues and active virtues, depending on how much we drink, but with spirits, it's active from the very start. Savonarola does not take himself for some godly figure, as opposed, and we can see that in the text, to those he criticizes. He does not pretend to seek for immortality. Instead, by transforming rather than creating matter, he aims at finding cures for diseases, particularly cold diseases, and reinventing theoretical potions through reasonable, rational practice. Savonarola praises wine whose solar heat he deems the purest. As a result, the water made from wine per se is a quintessential substance. Such vivifying and celestial heat generates pneuma, the Greek term for spiritus. Its power acts upon the heart, prevents from putrefaction, and could prolong life, but not make it everlasting. A clearly medicinal product, it also is more dangerous than wine if its uses are not strictly delimited. Savonarola discusses the best kinds of wine to be used for making divine water. So he enumerates in the text various wines, all of which are tannic red wines. He calls them vino nero, because he thinks it's better suited than any lighter wine, let alone white wine, by virtue of its powerful substance. Substance being something very important in the description, the medieval description of wine. So he gives examples of specific wines: Malvasia, the so-called Greek wine, Vernaccia, Trebbiano, Romagna, potentially, apparently cultivated around Rome, or Genoese. To him, wine is both unique and precious, particularly when pure and young. By young, he means that it's less than a year old. And yet it has to be strong but clear. So a paradox that some vintners may have to deal with today. Nicely scented and sweet, plus of a pleasant taste. He really insists on this, claiming that throughout the distillation processes, the taste and the smell will both transform, and it has to be of a special sweetness, suavitas. The result of the whole process actually depends on the core material, but also on the number of successive distillations. The first distillation is fundamental as it prepares the subsequent steps, mainly the separation between the four elements. But with this one, in this one, what matters is that fire and air be carefully captured. So this is called simple water. And he says it's beneficial even at that stage, in that it does not harm the liver, but still cures anything that the primary wine could cure. He claims to obtain burning water, aqua ardens, on the second distillation, and perfect water, aqua perfecta, perfecta, by the third distillation. As for the so-called quintessence, quinta essentia, it comes by the 7th to 10th distillations. This is something that others, such as Taddeo Alderotti, has said. Most of them mention the 7th. The 10th is rarer. So this is how the process becomes precious. Fire turns wine into, of a terrestrial nature, into spirit. At this stage, the liquor has become better than gold. An ironical and repeated wink at alchemists trying to obtain drinkable gold as a cure-all. Now, interestingly, he adds that taste is a form of touch. So this is Aristotelian, clearly. In fact, just like in the medical practice of touching a patient to sense his temperament, one may, they all claim, after Aristotle, through the sense of taste, perceive the quality of a substance, be it wine or spirit. Further, Savonarola declares that wine is the body, while aqua ardens is the soul. So here we're getting at something deeper. And we could be wondering if this is at the core of the name of the distilled liquor itself. So the concept seems rather easy to fathom. Because of the fiery elements, the solar beams having warmed the grapes, the liquor resulting from distillation is a mixture of fiery and celestial components endowed with divine heat. So this is, I'm repeating it less than he did. This is something that comes constantly back on the stage of this treatise. At some point, our author goes even further. I quote, "Wine spirits are the soul's instrument." So this partly explains why it is considered divine. Divine, he insists in its dignity. It comes from careful and knowledgeable practice, which almost, and the term is important, almost requires divine intervention. Now, how could such a perfect substance become noxious in any way? As opposed to our modern understanding, medieval men perceived what we would call alcoholism as a disease of the soul that poisons the body, which kept them from fully understanding both the etiology of the disease and its physiological consequences. Chronic drunkenness was perceived as a sin derived from gluttony, a sign of human weakness. If repeated, that sin turns into a vice and causes various kinds of alienations and illnesses. Conceptual differences such as these add to the difficulty of delineating limits or identifying the critical moment when the line is crossed into the territory of drunkenness. Very often, wine's virtuous properties are reversed in excess, and in their absence are replaced by various deviating behaviors. The dichotomy between virtue and vice, present in the medieval analysis of wine, became even more extreme when these physicians began to consider its distilled form. But while alchemists perceived the quintessence of wine as a conduit to heavenly influence, traditional physicians of the same period, such as our author, were aware of its potentially harmful effects. Upon entering people's lives on a regular basis, up to becoming fashionable, strong liquor left the healing and pleasurable spectrum to become dangerous, and a lot more than wine itself. This critique is discreet in the treatise, but nevertheless present, particularly when Savonarola advises not to buy it on the street. Unfortunately, such wise recommendation resulted in the spread of distillation as an individual practice. The design to help keep or restore health, thereby prolonging life, present in the term aqua vitae, was thus severely altered from the start, something wine advocates which would use much later to put forward the advantages of wine. I think precisely here, but there are plenty of others, of Thomas Jefferson, who elevated wine knowledge and careful tasting practice to a cure for the American weakness for hard liquor. So maybe that would be a way to get back to get some interest back to those medieval and early Renaissance texts and see what can still be seen as a cure rather than a scourge. Thank you very much. Here I brought some of the sources of Savonarola. So we see Taddeo Alderotti, Pietro d'Abano, and Avicenna, of course, Petrus Hispanus, and a bunch of others. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Azélina, for an interesting paper and staying within your time. Not everybody is as successful. I sense that there aren't any questions, which of course invites me to ask one. Where are we? Whoops, yes. Cécile Chevalier asks, is the divine dimension of wine linked in texts to its use in Christian rites, in the Mass, for example?
Yes, yes. It's always, there is an ambiguity because we don't, I mean, the ambiguity lies in the first aspect, was the divine dimension of wine first put forward by for medical reasons, or the reverse, and this is impossible to uncover. But definitely there is something, the divine aspect for wine, particularly for alcohol, for the distilled form. It's really something that's linked to something like the intellect agent, the agent intellect, rather than something to celebrate the liturgy. But definitely there is a constant component, especially in those texts, in Italian and French texts. It's never separable.
So I have a very maybe picayune question. The title of your paper, as published in the CoReMA documents, has an apostrophe after alcoholic, and I'm wondering if that simply means the open apostrophe was omitted in front of the words you were talking about, alcoholic recipes, or if there was a deeper meaning.
No, it was definitely because alcohol couldn't have been used at the time to designate this. So it's understandable by us today, but so that's how we called what they were doing, and that was connoted to more divine, surreal, super celestial, super terrestrial, celestial substances.
Thank you.
So there is another question coming from the Q&A from Erzsébet Kovács. Thank you for making clear the relationship between spirit and spirits. How do you think alcohol might have related to pre-modern body image? For example, role of heart and liver in the body.
In the same way as wine, except that the obtained water was warmer than wine, drier and more subtle, and could evaporate more readily. So as much or even more than wine, it could generate the blood. But this new substance, this spiritual substance, could regenerate. Savonarola gives this specification that it could generate the blood spirit. So the subtle part of the blood, maybe the more active one. Now there's another question.
Thank you. Yes, there is another question from Beatrice Regnault. Good evening. Thank you for your work. This approach resembles alchemy in particular with this notion of aquavitae. Can we interpret this transformation as a kind of search for eternity?
Definitely not by Savonarola, because actually he mentioned very clearly, I mean discreetly, but clearly that he was not doing any alchemical work in describing these processes. But the fact that he mentions it that clearly means that in his time there were people who pretended that distilling wine was akin to alchemical practices, and which means that aiming at immortality. But that's definitely not what he wanted to do. But that was definitely connected.
Since there seems an intelligent pause here, let us move then to our last speaker. Thank you very much, Azélina. So our third paper is being presented by Federica Badiali, who conducts interdisciplinary research in the field of cultural landscapes, with a special focus on food production and consumption in medieval and Renaissance Italy. Her co-author, Pietro Baraldi, is a chemist specializing in petroscopy, who has worked on Italian chemical or alchemical recipe collections and has expert knowledge of Renaissance pigments. Their topic today, between the lines of the recipe book, Cookery, Alchemy, Cosmetics, Metallurgy, and Medicines in Renaissance Ferrara, Italy, builds on their joint expertise. Federica.
Okay, thank you, Wendy. Thank you to everybody. Now I start with my presentation. I will talk about manuscript from Ferrara. So, like as Azélina, I am in the same city. Okay, a short summary. The first part of my presentation is about the manuscript. The second part is about the interdisciplinary methodology as tool for interpretation, not only of its manuscript, but more in general. The third part, I will show you some recipes, culinary recipes from the manuscript. The fourth part, a short chronological short talk about chronological and spatial distance in food heritage, and after conclusions. So this is our manuscript is an anonymous manuscript conserved in the Municipal Ariostea Library in Ferrara. Is a little volume, a paper volume with a very modest aspect, entirely devoid of any ornament. It has been written by 3 main hands in different moments. It's a little volume, but it contains 1,200 recipes of different types, medical recipes, cosmetic treatments, pigments, stain removers, chemical treatments for different materials, metal alloys, enology, veterinary medicine, and 240 cookery and pastry recipes. Those 240 recipes are in the most ancient part of the manuscript, together with medical recipes. We have no direct information about the origin and of the dating of this manuscript, but we have some indirect elements. For example, relevant events, Ferrara families and personalities are cited in the text between 1483 and 1535. In particular, the terminus post quem at the present stage of the research is the year 1535. The linguistic features clearly refer to the vernacular of Ferrara, with several words still used today, like levaduro, tegnizza, sorare, remolo, remola, lesegnaduro, spoglia, and so on. The Po River, who touched Ferrara in the Renaissance period, is mentioned too. Mettilo a cuocere nell'acqua de Po. But on the other hand, we have several references to geographical origin of different recipes, and that is an important demonstration of exchange and circulation of knowledge across Italy and Europe. The author. The author, we don't know he was the author. The manuscript is traditionally known as Pseudo Savonarola, but Michele Savonarola died in 1466. But the important element of the presence of both medical and cookery recipes and the use of abbreviation of chemical style suggests to us that the author might be a physician chemist of Ferrara, a physician chemist expert in cookery and aware of the connection between health and food. Bruno Laurioux underlined this important relation in the opening day of this Congress. And these were probably specific characteristics of the Middle Age and Renaissance physicians. So we don't have direct information about the author, but we have some tips. For example, the manuscript was reserved for a personal domestic use. Recipes are not in order, but we have little groups of connected recipes together in sequence, and we can find blank pages left. So probably the author or the collector had a project when he began to write this document. Another important consideration is that in most cases, we don't have comparison with the recipes, culinary recipes of the same period of context. In some recipes, we can find indication about the geographical origin, and the everyday cooking recipes are prevalent. The use of spices is present, but is a habit, not as an ostentation. But on the other hand, there is a group of highly specialized confectionery recipes probably from other authors. And at the end, the manuscript was used and enriched for decades in the same cultural, social context, because we have more than 3 ends. The distinct features of the manuscript are several. The most interesting is here in the picture. Is a very poor image, but it came from the microfilm. In the second line, we can observe very particular abbreviations and units of measurement that are typical of chemical medical style. And this is culinary recipe, tortelli magri. Therefore, we suppose that the writer could have been, as seen before, a physician chemist, particularly fond of cookery. Almost all the recipes begin with the abbreviation of the Latin term recipe, that means take. Is typical in the medieval and Renaissance recipe books, recipe, toi, toli, toli, piglia. And most of the culinary recipes in this manuscript cannot find comparison with other Renaissance recipe books, main recipe books like Maestro Martino, Platina, Colle, Mrs. Bugo, Scappi, Cervio, Rossetti, and so on. And the presence of the specific section of confectionery recipes is very important because those recipes required the presence of a specialized confectioner. So this element put the manuscript in the Este court context. This is a very complicated manuscript, is very complex. And to study this manuscript is necessary an interdisciplinary approach with comparison with other written sources like lists of expenses, literary sources, town charters or regulation. We can help our research with iconographic research, with archaeobotanical investigation, archaeological excavation to understand the butchery technology, for example, archaeological evidences for that purpose, experimental practice, and comparison with modern recipes and with modern ingredients. An example, this is an image from a Romanian website. Today in Italy, we use only parsley, prezzemolo, and celery, sedano, but in the manuscript are used levistico, lovage, leustean in Romanian, parsley root, radici de prezzemoli, radicina de patrugnei, parsnip, pastinaca, pasternak in Romanian, and celeriac, radice de cellero, radicina de celina. It's very interesting because the use of those vegetable is disappeared in the modern Italy, but it is present in other European countries. The manuscript. This is a couple of pages where we can observe the difference between the first hand on the left page, the left hand with culinary recipes, a far il pan di latte, a far le brazzadelle, a far crescenze di formaio. And the second hand here and in the right page. But those are completely different recipes. The first one is a medical recipe, and the other is a recipe to clean wine vessels. The recipe, the dinner time is coming, so I'd like to show you 4 culinary recipes from our manuscript. The first is an aperitif recipe, a far buon appetito. This is the recipe. A far buon appetito is a beverage made with rosemary flowers, boiled a decoction of rosemary flower in water. And this decoction is used to be mixed with wine. Here you can see the final effect. In the recipe we can read quando vuoi bevere, te farati buon appetito and buon stomaco. So is an appetizer and an aperitif and digestive beverage. For I took these pictures in my own kitchen. I tried to use the culinary tools, kitchen tools, as similar as possible to the Renaissance culinary kitchen tools. The second recipe is a sfogliata. Sfogliata belongs to the group of the torte. Is a sequence of duff layers. They are 7 in this case 7 layers of duff covered with sugar, cinnamon, cheese, and big amount of butter. This is my kitchen again. The third recipe is a recipe for ove piene. Those are the ove piene. Is a very simple recipe. Boiled eggs, after the boiling, the egg yolk has to be mixed with other ingredients, herbs, cheese, wine and vinegar, and after recomposed and cooked in the oven. The last one recipe that I'd like to show you is my favorite recipe among the 240 recipes of this manuscript, is la copertarda. Is a very particular recipe that cannot find comparison with other recipe, similar recipe in the other culinary collection of the same period. The result is sauce, a thick sauce to be spread on toasted bread. A sauce made by formado di forma duro grattato, that is cheese, probably Parmigiano Reggiano, egg yolks, garlic, all mixed together and slightly boiled with broth. The result, you can see here the result. So I have changed completely the picture. This is a modern tablecloth and this is a modern plate. Because I'd like to underline you that those recipes are perfectly modern. They don't need this is a general consideration. Renaissance recipes, in my opinion, don't need to be adapted or modified in consideration of our taste. The question is more simple. We can try to taste those food with an open mind, because it is impossible that we can forget our taste memory of pizza, of Nutella, of fried potatoes. We cannot forget those food, but with an open mind, we can simply, and with a lot of curiosity, we can simply taste and understand those recipes. Coming back to my summary, I have underlined there chronological and spatial distance in food heritage. This is an example of chronological and spatial distance in food heritage. This is not an example from from the manuscript that I and Professor Baraldi are studying, but it's an example from the Renaissance Ferrara, from Libro Novo of Cristoforo da Messisburgo, one of the most important cookbook of Renaissance. This is the recipe for pasta tedesca. That means German batter. Is a strange, if you read the recipe, that is a bit strange because it needs the use of a tool that is not clearly explained. But it was impossible to understand exactly how to do this recipe. But quite by chance, I found this advertising on the net, and is precisely the tool to prepare Scandinavian Rosette cookies. And I bought immediately on the net this tool, and in the box I found a recipe that was exactly the translation in English of the Messisburgo's recipe. So in my kitchen, dinner time is coming. In my kitchen, I've prepared this recipe. I don't know if I have prepared actually the Messisburgo recipes of the American recipe, but the result was very tasty. So we went from Renaissance Ferrara to United States, and from pasta tedesca, German batter, to Scandinavian Rosette. I have another, this is the most ancient image of this food. Is not a Renaissance image, is probably a picture from the late 19th century. Another example of chronological and spatial distance in food heritage is the distance between these two sisters. They are, I'm sure that those two cooks are sisters or probably twins, but the first on the left is in painting by Giacomo Leggi, 1630, and the cook on the right is in a picture of Bologna of 1950. But I'm sure that those ladies are twins. So we are quite on time. Those are my conclusions in company with Benvenuto Tisi da Garofalo, a beautiful Nozze di Cana. This manuscript is assembled by more than one author, but is unitary in its complexity. This is the great value of the manuscript. Through his reading shines the Este court life. In that context, I'd like to underline that the addition of sugar and the cinnamon at the end of many recipes in the manuscript represents an eating habit in the everyday courtly life, not a demonstration of wealth and power to important guests. Therefore, in my opinion, the modern concept of Renaissance banqueting probably needs to be downsized, underlining the difference between the appearance of the off-sham banquets and everyday food that probably was simpler than the historical tradition supposes. In fact, Michele Savonarola wrote an important work, an important work in which he explains to Borso d'Este which food to eat to preserve health. So the health of the Duke was a consequence of food eating. The purpose of these recipe books, which was the purpose of this manuscript? It was to offer a solution to any problem, big or small, as in the housewife handbooks of the last century. I'm sorry, this is a bit strong, a bit brave comparison, but it is only to show you that what is exceptional today, for example, our manuscript is an exceptional manuscript for us. What is exceptional today was normal in the past. This manuscript was a very normal book, manuscript for everyday use. So we are more comfortable in company of Benvenuto Tisi da Garofalo. So this manuscript shows to us which were the most common needs and habits, particularly of food and health, and furthermore, it offers to us a more thoroughly knowledge on the social and cultural context of the Este court. Bibliographical references, and many thanks for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Federica. I know that there's a question in the Q&A. Helmut?
Yes, we have one question from Alan Greco, and he says, thank you for this talk. I'm working on spice consumption a little earlier, but was wondering what you meant when the use was not ostentatious, but rather a habit. Could you elaborate on this distinction?
Yes, reading and studying this manuscript, we noticed that the phrase put a phrase that is normal at the end of culinary recipes, put cinnamon and sugar on the top. But in those recipes, in the manuscript, this seems more an habit in the daily cook. All of those recipes are more simple than the recipes for special occasion, as in the book of Mrs. Bugo. Those recipes has in prevalence of vegetables, of eggs, of poultry, are simple and quick to prepare, and the addiction of species is taste habit. and is different because in the official occasion, the use of spices was more important. It was probably used to show wealthy and important of the householder in the important official occasion.
Thank you very much. We have one question from Bruno, and then another question in the Q&A.
Okay. Thank you for your very interesting communication. I'm not surprised that new manuscripts in Italy are found. And I think there will be many, many others. And it's really fascinating to know that. I have two questions about this manuscript. First, about the datation, because we have a terminus postquem.
Yes.
No more. It's on paper, no, isn't it?
Yes.
So could you check the watermarks?
Yes, there are watermarks. They were very recently studied by Mirna Bonazza. She is the chief of the manuscript section in the Ferrara Ariostea library. But I received this information yesterday from Mirna Bonazza. But we agree because the paper of the most ancient section is coincident with the datation of the terminus postquem.
Okay, perfect. And the second question is about the comparisons, because in fact, if we compare, as you said, with Mrs. Bougot or others, this kind of cookery books, there can be big difference. But in the first half of 16th century, in fact, one of the most influential book was Martineau's book, but not only Martineau's canonical text, but all the manuscripts, depending on Martineau, maybe adding many things. For example, the Welcome manuscript, the Shakespeare manuscript, and another manuscript which is not known, in fact, but to my mind is important. It's the Como manuscript in Como.
Como? Yes.
Yeah. So maybe I can help you to give you the
yes.
text.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Of course, it's a collaboration.
Yes. Yes.
We can organize maybe seminars or webinars on the
Why
subject.
not? Good idea.
Because for me, I think I recognize some recipes. So maybe we have to do this. We have to help you to this comparison.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have lots of questions pending and little time late.
It's an important question.
Maybe you could discuss this privately after the webinar. So the next question from Young-Sun Ra is, hi, thank you for the presentation. In terms of food or cuisine, can we say the late Middle Age is clearly distinguished from Renaissance, at last maybe in Italy?
Can we say the Latin? Is a complicated question because the cook changed very slowly in those periods, and we can find elements of continuity and elements of interruption, the introduction of new ingredients and so on. But in my opinion, a rigid distinction is not possible, I think. Now we are very quick, so we can distinguish between different kind of cooking habits, but in this period it was impossible, in my opinion.
Yes, I would support this answer, because history is very slow moving, and yes, there are no sudden changes.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the answer. I'm moving on to the next one. It's from Marion Lamé, and I try to summarize the question. She wonders if you or somebody else in the audience or from the speakers has any tip which of all the possible medieval and Renaissance sweet dishes you would cook for your friends this Pentecost weekend.
I'm sorry, but in this period there were not no distinction between sweet food and normal dishes as today. Today we have meal, soup, and at the end of the dinner we are used to eat a piece of cake, for example, a dessert. In the early Renaissance period, the only food reserved to the end of the dinner was candied fruits or confetti or confectionery in general. So for example, we could use the sfogliata that I show you in my presentation as a sweet dessert, very simply with the addition of more sugar on the top. Or for example, preparing the rosette cookies with a lot of sugar, but rosette cookies in the Mrs. Bugo recipes can be also salted food to be filled with cheese, for example. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to move on to the next question from Camilla Caviacci. Does the manuscript preserve also recipes for varnish or musical instruments?
Yes, I don't know, because I've studied only I personally studied only the culinary recipes, but my colleague, Professor Baraldi, transcribed the whole manuscript. So I have the transcription, I check it for Camilla, yes.
Thank you, and she also says thanks a lot for this interesting presentation. We have another question from
yes, yes. I read it. Yes, okay. Yes, the torta tedesca, la torta all'allemande, the German cake. This recipe is in the Mrs. Bugo book too. The torta tedesca is a cake of apples, sugar, cinnamon, and butter. Probably is close to the idea of modern strudel, but torta tedesca in Mrs. Bugo's work, but the use of this kind of dishes in the Renaissance period was not reserved to the end of the dinner. This is important. For us is at the end of the dinner, but in the Renaissance and medieval period, torte were used in different moments of the dinner, not at the end.
On that sweet note,
yes.
And at the end of a magnificent session with 3 very interesting papers that I think all, I'm not sure they skirted on the edge of cookery. I think they all dove deeply into cookery. I want to thank all of our speakers. I want to thank Helmut, who did a great job managing the Q&A, and our tech person hiding in the background, Christophe Dargel, and all the participants for what has been a super good session. I remind everybody that this session has been recorded and will be available tomorrow on the CoReMA YouTube channel. And I want to say goodbye, and may those of you for whom it's dinner time have a bon appetit, have a good dinner with my wishes for bon appetit. And here's to the to seeing people through Zoom at the remaining sessions of this outstanding conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you too. Thank you too. Bye.
Thank you.